By late afternoon, the dark waters southwest of the Bashi Channel were choked with a massive triangle of burning oil, toxic black smoke, and the shattered hulls of 3 American guided missile destroyers. The Surface Action Group had entered the northern South China Sea as an impenetrable fortress of layered air defense, but now, the lead ship was completely missing its forward superstructure, leaving only a smoking crater of melted steel where the bridge used to be. A second destroyer was listing hard to starboard, its radar arrays sheared off and collapsing into the waves, while the third drifted backward without power, pouring flames from a massive breach near the waterline. Survival rafts bobbed in the heavy swells, surrounded by shattered fiberglass and the sickening smell of scorched electronics. The battle had lasted less than 12 minutes, yet it had completely dismantled a premier naval escort screen without a single enemy vessel ever crossing the horizon. The question was not how the ships had burned, but how the defensive shield had been broken so instantly from above. To understand how the kill zone was formed, the battle must return to the moment the first anomaly appeared. 4:20 in the afternoon on the 22nd of June, 2026, at 20 degrees 45 minutes north and 119 degrees 30 minutes east, the United States Navy Surface Action Group carved a fast path through deep swells. The sea conditions were rough, with sharp winds tearing whitecaps off the dark water. The sky was an unbroken canopy of gray clouds, pressing heavily over the ocean and limiting visual range. The 3 destroyers moved in a tight, overlapping defensive formation, their powerful phased array radars sweeping the atmosphere, searching for anything that dared to approach their airspace. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead ship, the atmosphere was cooled and quiet, filled only with the low hum of server racks and the steady green glow of the tactical displays. Suddenly, the high-altitude search operators noticed a flicker on the edge of the screen. It was not a sea-skimming cruise missile. It was not a fighter jet pushing through the cloud layer. It was a faint, impossibly fast contact dropping from the extreme upper atmosphere, descending at a velocity that the tracking algorithms struggled to classify. Within 3 seconds, the tactical computer highlighted the anomaly in flashing red, projecting a downward trajectory that pointed directly at the center of the American formation. The speed was registering above Mach 8, and the target was maneuvering erratically as it skipped across the edge of the atmosphere, bleeding heat and speed, but refusing to fly in a predictable ballistic arc. The combat alarm instantly shattered the quiet hum of the control room. Piercing electronic tones echoed through the steel corridors of all 3 warships, sending hundreds of sailors sprinting toward their battle stations. Heavy, watertight doors slammed shut and locked with heavy metallic thuds. Damage control teams strapped into fire-resistant flash gear, their boots echoing loudly against the metal decks. In the command center, the tactical action officer shouted for an immediate track identification, but the system could not secure a clean lock. The incoming contact was moving too fast, hiding behind a sheath of superheated plasma that absorbed and scattered the defensive radar waves. Across the fleet, the gas turbine engines roared into maximum overdrive, churning the dark ocean into massive wakes of white foam, as the heavy destroyers attempted to scatter and break the targeting solution. But the high-altitude contact was not alone. 2 more faint signals blossomed on the edge of space, diving steeply toward the other 2 ships. The invisible dome of the Aegis combat system was now staring straight up, attempting to build a firing solution against an enemy that was falling faster than anything the fleet had ever engaged. The engagement window was collapsing into seconds, and the ultimate naval battle was about to erupt. As the 3 American destroyers pushed their gas turbine engines to absolute limits, a very different kind of mobilization was already underway deep inside the Asian mainland. More than 1,500 kilometers away, hidden beneath the dense cloud cover of the southern coastal mountains, the Chinese rocket force was completing the final steps of a massive synchronized deployment. Heavy diesel engines roared through narrow valley roads, as a dozen massive transport and erector vehicles rolled out from deep underground bunkers. The massive heavy trucks ground to a halt on reinforced concrete firing pads, their air brakes hissing loudly in the cold, damp mountain air. Immediately, ground crews leapt from the support vehicles, their boots splashing through muddy puddles as they connected thick power cables to the launch control cabins. The smell of wet earth and raw diesel fuel filled the valley. Inside the cramped, red-lit command trucks, targeting officers stared at digital maps that were rapidly updating with live telemetry from orbital satellites and high-altitude drones. The space-based sensors were feeding the exact coordinates, speed, and heading of the American Surface Action Group directly into the firing computers. The order to prepare for immediate launch flashed across the screens. Outside, heavy hydraulic pumps began to scream. Massive steel erector arms slowly pushed the heavy cylindrical launch canisters upward, elevating the hypersonic weapons until they pointed directly at the dark, overcast sky. The sheer size of the missiles made the heavy trucks vibrate as the internal gyroscopes spun up to combat speed, locking in the final navigational data. Back out over the dark waters of the South China Sea, the three destroyers were tearing the ocean apart. The ships were now moving at 32 knots, their sharp bows violently slamming into the heavy swells and throwing massive sheets of white salt water over the forward decks. The sheer physical force of the acceleration made the steel floors vibrate violently under the boots of the crew. The piercing wail of the combat alarm continued to echo through every corridor. In the combat information centers, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The tactical action officers barked rapid commands, desperately trying to network the three ships together to share radar data. They needed to build a unified defensive picture before the falling targets crossed the terminal engagement threshold. Every available sensor was pointed upward. The massive hexagonal radar plates mounted on the sides of the ship's superstructures pumped maximum electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere, trying to burn through the plasma sheaths surrounding the incoming glide vehicles. Air defense operators gripped their consoles, sweating inside their flash gear, their eyes locked on the faint, erratic tracks bouncing across their screens. Below decks, the automatic loading systems of the vertical launch cells whirred into motion, bringing the heavy interceptor missiles online. On the forward decks, the heavy steel hatches of the vertical launch systems snapped open, exposing the dark firing tubes to the howling wind and sea spray. The battlefield was now fully connected across land, sea, and space. The American fleet was desperately maneuvering to survive, while the inland missile batteries waited in deadly silence, their launch tubes fully vertical and their firing computers completely locked. The passive hunting phase was permanently over. The invisible targeting web had closed tightly around the three warships, and the massive machinery of modern war was fully awake, driving both sides into a high-speed countdown toward destruction. As the massive vertical launch systems opened their heavy steel hatches to the wind, an invisible war of electromagnetic energy violently erupted across the South China Sea. Inside the American combat information centers, the highly organized green geometry of the radar screens suddenly shattered into a chaotic storm of white static and jagged interference lines. The Chinese targeting satellites, drifting silently in low Earth orbit, were continuously beaming high-density telemetry down to the inland missile batteries, locking an inescapable digital net around the fleet. To break this kill chain, the electronic warfare officers aboard the three destroyers unleashed the absolute maximum power of their defensive jamming suites. High on the towering ship masts, the heavy antenna arrays pumped out massive, blinding pulses of electromagnetic noise. The American warships created a thick dome of digital interference, generating dozens of phantom signatures, false ship wakes, and decoy targets across the radio spectrum. The cooling fans inside the massive server racks screamed at a high pitch as the electronic warfare systems drew extreme power from the main turbine generators. Deep inside the hulls, the red battle lighting flickered slightly under the immense electrical load. The operators sweat inside their heavy fire-resistant flash gear, their hands moving violently over the consoles as they attempted to manually scramble the incoming targeting frequencies. The American ships threw everything they had into the air to break the lock. Decoy launchers mounted on the outer decks fired aggressively, sending thick clouds of metallic chaff and floating thermal flares high into the storm clouds above. Thousands of burning strips of foil drifted over the heavy swells, attempting to create a massive false metal cloud that would distract the falling seekers. At the same moment, the ships veered hard, executing violent evasive turns that caused the heavy steel bulkheads to groan under the sheer physical stress. Freezing saltwater washed over the forward decks as the massive gray hulls tilted sharply into the rough waves. But high above the atmosphere, the incoming threats began to adapt instantly. The Chinese hypersonic glide vehicles were not relying entirely on standard radar, as they skipped across the thin upper air like flat stones over a pond, executing violent, unpredictable lateral maneuvers at Mach 8. Their internal computers automatically shifted tracking modes, Their nose cones housed advanced thermal optical seekers that easily pierced through the wall of American radio static. They ignored the electronic ghosts, ignored the drifting metallic chaff, and locked their sights directly onto the massive heat plumes, radiating from the gas turbine engines of the three destroyers tearing across the cold ocean below. Back in the inland mountain valleys, more than 1,500 kilometers away, the digital firing displays inside the cramped, red-lit command trucks flashed a solid, unbroken green. The electronic wall had completely failed to blind the space tier sensors. The target lock was absolute. The Chinese firing coordinators gripped their authorization keys, their breathing steady, staring at the live telemetry screens that confirmed the three American warships were pinned perfectly inside the mathematical kill box. Out on the dark water, the tactical action officers aboard the destroyers watched in absolute horror as the erratic, falling tracks on their main screens suddenly stabilized into perfect, solid red lines. The jamming had not broken the lock. The incoming glide vehicles had burned right through the electronic countermeasures. The piercing wail of the combat alarm seemed to grow louder as the engagement window collapsed from a matter of minutes down to mere seconds. The heavy interceptor missiles sitting in the forward launch tubes were now fully fueled, their internal gyroscopes spinning at maximum velocity, directly connected to the fire control radars. The entire battlefield hung suspended in the agonizing, suffocating silence of the final digital handshake. The electronic war was over, and the explosive kinetic slaughter was about to begin. With the electronic shield completely shattered and the target lock confirmed, the decisive firing order was finally given. Deep inside the hidden mountain valleys, the Chinese rocket force commanders simultaneously turned their authorization keys and pressed the launch triggers. The massive solid fuel boosters of the heavy ballistic missiles ignited with a deafening, earth-shattering roar. A blinding flash of orange fire instantly vaporized the mud and rainwater pooling on the concrete launch pads. Heavy acoustic shockwaves violently hammered against the valley walls, shaking the wet pine trees and vibrating the steel chassis of the command trucks. Thick, scorching columns of white exhaust billowed outward, turning the dark, damp landscape into a blinding inferno. The massive cylindrical weapons pushed out of their hydraulic erector tubes, fighting gravity for a split second before their main engines reached full thrust. The heavy anti-ship missiles accelerated upward into the dark sky, leaving brilliant, burning trails of rocket exhaust that pierced straight through the dense gray cloud cover. Within seconds, they were moving at supersonic speeds, tearing through the lower atmosphere on a steep, aggressive angle toward the edge of space. The sheer kinetic force of their ascent left a deep, tearing sound rolling across the mountains long after the missiles had disappeared into the overcast sky. More than 1,500 kilometers away, over the rough waters of the South China Sea, the massive launch signatures instantly registered on the American infrared early warning satellites. The data was beamed directly down to the lead destroyer, confirming the inbound threat. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer stared at the flashing red lines dropping from the extreme upper edge of the tactical display. The time to impact was evaporating. He authorized the immediate release of the fleet defensive interceptors, pushing the combat system into full automated firing mode. On the forward deck of the lead destroyer, the Mark 41 vertical launch system violently erupted. Massive pillars of blinding white fire blasted out of the heavy steel cells, instantly turning the dark, rolling ocean into bright daytime. The sheer explosive force of the launch shook the entire ship's superstructure, throwing heavy, jarring vibrations through the wet steel deck plates. The Standard Missile 3 interceptors roared out of their firing tubes, ripping through the cold salt spray and climbing vertically into the howling wind. Across the tight naval formation, the other two destroyers immediately followed suit. Dozens of heavy steel hatches snapped open, and a continuous wave of defensive missiles thundered into the sky. The deafening roar of solid rocket motors drowned out the sound of the crashing ocean swells. The dark clouds above the fleet rapidly filled with thick white smoke and crisscrossing trails of burning propellant. The interceptors pushed violently through the sound barrier, their advanced guidance computers desperately calculating the projected intercept geometry against targets that were falling from space. The entire battlefield was now entirely kinetic. High above the Earth, the heavy Chinese booster stages burned out and detached, releasing the sleek, wedge-shaped hypersonic glide vehicles into the freezing vacuum. The terrifying weapons immediately pitched down, catching the thin upper atmosphere and beginning their ultra-fast, erratic surf toward the ocean surface. Far below, the American interceptors were racing upward, burning their own massive engines to exhaustion as they tried to reach the exact point of interception. The empty air above the South China Sea was suddenly crowded with burning rocket motors and falling warheads, leaving the 3 warships trapped directly underneath the incoming storm. High above the dark water, the swarm of American defensive interceptors desperately reached the highest point of their arc. But the Chinese hypersonic glide vehicles simply stepped out of the way. Moving at more than Mach 10, the falling wedges of solid metal executed a violent, lateral skip across the upper atmosphere, easily evading the predictable ballistic calculations of the Aegis combat system. The American missiles sailed harmlessly into the black void of space, their solid rocket fuel completely exhausted. Unopposed, the incoming glide vehicles pitched sharply downward for their final terminal dive. They tore through the thick gray cloud layer like glowing meteors, encased in searing sheaths of superheated plasma that painted the dark, rolling ocean below in an eerie, blinding orange light. The sheer friction of their descent ripped the air apart, creating a continuous, deafening sonic boom that cascaded down toward the fleet. The lead glide vehicle locked its thermal seeker onto the massive heat plume of the Central American destroyer and plunged toward the ocean surface at an impossible downward angle. Inside the Combat Information Center of the targeted warship, the tactical action officer had less than 2 seconds to brace before the sheer kinetic mass of the weapon arrived. There was no traditional explosive detonation. The destruction was purely physical, driven by raw, unstoppable velocity. The hypersonic warhead slammed directly into the forward superstructure of the warship with the terrifying force of a falling asteroid. The kinetic impact instantly erased the main bridge, shearing away the heavy steel bulkheads and vaporizing the entire command deck into a blinding flash of white-hot slag. The sheer downward velocity of the strike punched a massive, glowing crater straight through the center of the ship, instantly buckling the forward deck plates and tearing the outer hull wide open along the waterline. The catastrophic shockwave traveled straight down into the forward Mark 41 vertical launch cells, crushing the remaining fully fueled interceptor missiles and triggering a massive secondary chain reaction. A towering pillar of heavy black smoke and roaring orange fire erupted from the bow, throwing shattered steel, burning radar arrays, and melted fiberglass hundreds of feet into the howling wind. The deafening, physical boom of the impact rolled heavily across the rough swells, slamming into the 2 escorting destroyers with a concussive force that violently rattled their bulkheads and threw sailors to the metal floors. On the lead ship, the massive gas turbine engines immediately seized as the internal electrical grid completely collapsed. The crippled warship instantly lost all propulsion, its blackened, twisted bow dropping heavily into the deep ocean swells. Thick, choking black smoke billowed from the glowing impact crater, completely obscuring the shattered remains of the main mast. Freezing salt water violently flooded into the lower compartments through the ruptured hull plates, while secondary fuel fires quickly spread across the twisted, melted wreckage of the forward decks. The impenetrable Aegis defensive shield was officially broken. The meticulously organized surface action group was suddenly reduced to a chaotic survival zone, with the lead command vessel transformed into a drifting, burning wreck in a matter of seconds. But the Chinese assault was far from finished. The remaining 2 destroyers were now completely exposed, knocked out of their tight defensive formation, and staring up at a dark sky that was still actively raining fire. While the burning wreckage of the lead command ship drifted helplessly in the rough swells, the 2 surviving American destroyers desperately fought to regain control of the chaotic battlefield. Inside their combat information centers, the surviving tactical action officers rapidly transferred command authority, trying to re-establish a unified defensive grid through the thick interference of the heavy black smoke. But the Chinese forces did not give them time to recover. Before the shockwave of the first impact had fully dissipated, a completely different type of threat materialized on the tactical displays. The high-altitude hypersonic strike had been the sledgehammer, but now came the saturation swarm. Dozens of low-altitude, subsonic anti-ship cruise missiles, launched from distant coastal bombers, were suddenly detected perfectly hugging the crests of the ocean waves, rushing in from 3 different directions to finish the crippled fleet. The combat alarm shrieked at a fever pitch as the remaining American warships violently turned their bows into the incoming swarm. They were not going to simply wait to be destroyed. The heavy Mark 41 vertical launch systems on both ships erupted in a continuous, deafening sequence. White pillars of solid rocket exhaust rapidly stacked into the dark gray sky as dozens of Standard Missile-6 interceptors tore out of their cells. The ships aggressively pumped fire into the lower atmosphere, desperately trying to thin the incoming swarm before it reached terminal range. The air over the churning South China Sea transformed into a chaotic web of crisscrossing smoke trails and brilliant orange detonations as the interceptors slammed into the low-flying cruise missiles miles away from the hulls. But the swarm was incredibly dense, and several sea-skimming missiles broke through the outer missile screen, diving even lower to evade radar detection. As the incoming threats crossed the 3 nautical mile threshold, the American close-in weapon systems automatically woke up. The heavy, white-domed radar-guided Gatling guns mounted on the ship's superstructures violently spun up with a deep, mechanical growl. Seconds later, they unleashed a terrifying, unbroken stream of heavy tungsten tracer rounds, firing 4,500 rounds per minute. The blinding yellow lines of tracer fire cut flat across the dark ocean, creating a massive wall of flying metal. The air filled with the deafening sound of tearing canvas as the massive Gatling guns tracked the incoming targets. One by one, the Chinese cruise missiles flew directly into the wall of tungsten, shattering into thousands of pieces of burning aluminum and fiberglass that violently skipped across the water and rained down around the American hulls. At the same time, the heavy 5-inch naval guns on the forward decks roared to life, firing heavy explosive shells that threw massive columns of water into the air, attempting to crush the lowest flying missiles with sheer hydraulic pressure. The 2 destroyers successfully fought like trapped animals, filling the air with explosive force and violently shredding the low-altitude ambush. Burning debris and thick black oil from the destroyed cruise missiles littered the waves in every direction. The defensive crews gripped their consoles, drenched in sweat. As the radar screens finally cleared of the low-flying contacts, they had successfully stabilized the immediate perimeter. But the furious defensive effort had rapidly emptied their vertical launch cells, exhausted their immediate countermeasures, and forced their massive radar arrays to focus entirely on the horizon. The sea-skimming swarm had never been meant to sink them. It was a brilliant, sacrificial distraction designed to pull their eyes downward, leaving the vertical airspace completely ignored as the true killing blow was already dropping from the stratosphere. Just as the exhausted gun crews watched the final pieces of shattered cruise missiles sink beneath the rolling waves, the true threat reappeared at the absolute edge of the atmosphere. The American phased array radars, still smoking from the massive energy output required to track the sea-skimming targets, instantly snapped their focus straight up into the dark, overcast sky. The tactical displays inside the 2 surviving combat information centers violently flashed red as the system detected a second, far more massive wave of high-altitude contacts. The Chinese rocket force had staggered their launch sequence perfectly. The low-altitude cruise missile swarm had successfully dragged the American defensive interceptors out of their vertical launch cells, leaving the 2 remaining destroyers staring up at an impossible tactical problem with completely depleted magazines. High above the heavy storm clouds, a fresh salvo of heavy hypersonic glide vehicles detached from their booster stages and pitched down into the thinning air. Moving at Mach 10, the dark metal wedges instantly ignited into searing streaks of orange plasma as they violently grabbed the upper atmosphere. They did not fly in straight lines. They executed aggressive, jagged corkscrew maneuvers, bleeding off extreme heat while maintaining an impossible downward velocity. The sheer thermal energy of their descent painted the thick cloud cover with terrifying flashes of lightning-like illumination, signaling their catastrophic approach long before the sonic boom reached the ocean surface. Aboard the surviving destroyers, the combat system automatically attempted to build a firing solution, but the heavy steel hatches of the forward vertical launch systems remained open and completely empty. Only a handful of interceptors remained deep in the aft cells. The automated sequence initiated instantly, sending the last few Standard missile interceptors roaring into the sky. The white pillars of exhaust looked desperately thin against the massive, glowing threat dropping from above. The American missiles burned their solid fuel to the absolute limit, racing upward to intercept the falling plasma streaks. But the math simply failed. The Chinese glide vehicles easily executed a final, violent, lateral shift, completely outrunning the intercepting warheads and leaving the American missiles detonating harmlessly in the empty upper air. The final layer of the impenetrable Aegis shield had completely collapsed. The two heavy destroyers were now naked against the kinetic strike. The terrified crews braced for impact as the deafening, physical roar of the falling weapons tore the sky apart. The incoming hypersonic vehicles plunged straight through the low cloud layer, instantly vaporizing the heavy rain and turning the dark air into a blinding furnace. The sheer aerodynamic pressure preceding the weapons created a massive shockwave that hit the rough ocean surface first, flattening the rolling swells and throwing a massive ring of white water outward before the warheads even made physical contact. In the combat information centers, the warning tones merged into one continuous, high-pitched scream. The electronic warfare officers jammed their consoles to maximum power, desperately trying to throw up one last wall of digital interference. But the thermal optical seekers on the nose cones of the glide vehicles were already physically locked onto the glowing gas turbine engine exhausts. The heavy gray warships threw their rudders hard over, attempting to turn tightly into the massive waves to avoid a direct midship strike. But the sheer velocity of the falling wedges made evasive maneuvering completely irrelevant. The heavy interceptors were gone. The Gatling guns could not track targets falling at Mach 10, and the sky was completely filled with unstoppable, blinding fire dropping straight toward the steel decks. The final hypersonic weapons broke through the cloud cover at Mach 10, perfectly aligned to annihilate the defenseless American warships. The first kinetic wedge slammed directly into the aft flight deck of the starboard destroyer. The sheer downward velocity instantly crushed the reinforced steel hangar doors, obliterating the parked helicopters inside and driving a massive column of explosive force deep into the engineering spaces below. The catastrophic impact shattered the main gas turbine generators, instantly plunging the massive warship into total darkness. The immense physical shockwave rippled forward through the hull, buckling the main deck plates and snapping the massive structural keel. The warship violently rolled hard to starboard, its heavy rudders locking in place as millions of gallons of freezing salt water began pouring into the ruptured lower compartments. A fraction of a second later, the final two hypersonic vehicles struck the portside destroyer simultaneously. One impacted just behind the main bridge, tearing a massive, glowing trench through the combat superstructure and cleanly severing the heavy communication antennas. The second struck the forward vertical launch system, burying itself deep into the missile magazine and triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion. A blinding sphere of white and orange fire erupted from the bow, violently throwing heavy steel hatches, twisted launch tubes, and melted radar arrays hundreds of feet into the howling wind. The sheer concussive force of the internal detonation blew the outer hull plates outward, exposing the burning lower decks directly to the crashing ocean waves. Inside the combat information center of the starboard ship, the glowing tactical displays violently shattered as the heavy consoles tore free from the metal deck. The crew was thrown brutally against the slanting bulkheads, surrounded by showers of sparking wires and choking electrical smoke. The sheer physical trauma of the strike had liquefied the internal command structure. The entire battlefield was instantly silenced of its roaring defensive gunfire, replaced by the deafening sound of uncontrollable electrical fires and the agonizing shriek of tearing metal. The once impenetrable surface action group completely ceased to exist as a fighting force. The starboard destroyer was now dead in the water, listing at a severe 45-degree angle, its aft section completely swallowed by roaring flames and thick, toxic black smoke. The portside destroyer was drifting backward without propulsion, its shattered bow plunging dangerously low into the heavy swells as massive volumes of ocean water flooded the forward compartments. The dark water of the South China Sea quickly transformed into a massive, apocalyptic graveyard of twisted steel and burning chemicals. Thousands of gallons of heavy aviation fuel and marine diesel poured from the violently ruptured hulls, spreading rapidly across the rough swells. The fuel instantly ignited on the surface, creating a sprawling, roaring carpet of fire that physically connected the three crippled warships in a burning triangle. The intense heat generated by the massive oil fires began to melt the floating fiberglass debris, sending thick, suffocating plumes of toxic black smoke rolling across the battered decks. Inside the darkened, tilted corridors of the shattered ships, the piercing wails of the combat alarms slowly died out as the internal batteries failed, leaving only the sound of rushing water, frantic shouting, and the heavy crash of the storm outside. The highly coordinated naval escort screen had been systematically dismantled from above, violently crushed in mere minutes, leaving only shattered, sinking monuments to a total tactical collapse. The roaring carpet of surface fire slowly separated the three crippled destroyers, transforming the high-speed naval engagement into a desperate battle for pure survival. Inside the slanting, smoke-filled corridors of the starboard ship, damage control teams fought through absolute darkness, guided only by the faint red glow of battery-powered emergency lights. Exhausted sailors waded waist-deep through freezing salt water and floating debris, dragging heavy wooden shores and steel wedges down into the flooded engineering spaces. They fought furiously to brace the buckling bulkheads, their voices raw from shouting over the terrifying sound of the ocean tearing at the shattered outer hull. Topside, the situation was completely apocalyptic. Firefighting teams stumbled across wet, slanted deck plates, dragging heavy canvas hoses through the slick oil. They blasted thick white chemical foam directly into the melting craters of the vertical launch cells, desperately trying to prevent the remaining defensive missiles from cooking off in the extreme heat. The rubber soles of their boots literally melted against the scorching steel as they dragged wounded crewmates backward on heavy metal litters. Out on the dark, churning water, dozens of sailors who had been violently thrown overboard were now fighting for their lives in the freezing swells. The ocean surface was a nightmare of toxic black oil and patches of burning aviation fuel. Survivors clung desperately to yellow inflatable life rafts and the shattered, floating remnants of fiberglass radar domes. The air was suffocatingly thick with the smell of scorched plastic, raw diesel, and burning electronics. Suddenly, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades cut through the howling wind. A flight of MH-60 Seahawk rescue helicopters, launched from an American carrier strike group hundreds of miles to the east, finally reached the outer edge of the kill zone. The heavy helicopters dropped out of the gray storm clouds and hovered dangerously low over the burning fleet. Their massive rotor wash violently kicked up blinding sheets of white salt spray, physically pushing the surface fires away from the floating survivors. Side doors slid open, and heavily equipped rescue swimmers leaped from the cabins, plunging directly into the freezing, oil-slicked waves. The rescue operators swam frantically through the heavy swells, grabbing exhausted sailors and strapping them into heavy metal rescue baskets. The mechanical winches on the helicopters screamed as they rapidly hoisted the soaking, oil-covered survivors up into the crowded cabins. Below them, heavily armored salvage vessels were already cutting through the waves, moving in to secure towing lines to the drifting, unpowered destroyer hulls before they could completely roll over and sink. But even as the massive extraction effort accelerated, a terrifying psychological weight settled over the burning battlefield. The surviving tactical action officers stood on the shattered, wind-blasted remnants of their command decks, staring up at the dark sky. Their powerful Aegis radars were completely dead. The vertical launch cells were either empty or destroyed. They had absolutely no way to see over the horizon, and no way to defend themselves if the Chinese missile batteries decided to fire a third wave. The immediate kinetic slaughter had ended, but the battlefield remained completely under enemy control, leaving the once-invincible surface action group desperately trying to pull its wounded from the water before the towering gray hulls finally slipped beneath the dark waves. As the rescue helicopters hoisted the final few survivors from the freezing, oil-slicked waves, the true shockwave of the violent engagement was just beginning to reach the highest levels of global military command. Halfway across the world, deep underground inside the Pacific Fleet headquarters in Hawaii, the massive digital operations room was completely silent. The space was bathed in a heavy, suffocating red light as dozens of senior admirals, combat analysts, and intelligence officers stood paralyzed, staring up at the towering main crisis screens. They were watching the live, high-resolution satellite feeds streaming directly from the northern South China Sea. On the massive monitors, the three American guided missile destroyers were no longer majestic symbols of naval dominance. They were reduced to nothing more than glowing thermal signatures, crippled metal husks drifting endlessly inside a massive, sprawling triangle of burning surface oil. The silence in the command center was heavy with the terrifying weight of undeniable proof. The unthinkable had actually happened, and the raw telemetry data scrolling across the secondary screens confirmed every catastrophic detail. A premier surface action group, protected by the most heavily tested and advanced layered air defense network ever built, had been systematically dismantled in less than 15 minutes. The American warships had fired every weapon they had, completely emptying their vertical launch cells, and they had still failed to survive the engagement. Worse still, the enemy had executed the entire slaughter without a single warship, fighter jet, or submarine ever crossing the visible horizon. The Chinese rocket force had mathematically proven that their heavy hypersonic glide vehicles could reliably bypass the Aegis combat system, effortlessly outrun the fastest American interceptor missiles, and strike with absolute kinetic precision from the freezing edge of space. The strategic consequence of the violent ambush rippled outward instantly, paralyzing naval operations across the entire Pacific theater. Hundreds of miles to the east, an American aircraft carrier strike group that had been steaming at maximum speed to reinforce the region received an immediate, highly classified flash override. The massive nuclear-powered carrier and its remaining escort vessels violently reversed course, churning the ocean into heavy white wakes as they physically turned away from the battle space. Command authorities simply could not risk bringing a multi-billion-dollar flight deck into an established kill zone that could not be effectively defended against an orbital strike. By forcing the carrier group to retreat, the hypersonic barrage had achieved its ultimate strategic goal. The Bashi Channel and the entire northern South China Sea were immediately sealed off, instantly transformed from a heavily navigated international shipping corridor into a highly lethal, mathematically locked anti-access fortress. The shock of the defeat quickly spilled over into the civilian world, triggering an immediate and catastrophic global reaction. Commercial shipping conglomerates issued emergency orders, halting hundreds of massive oil tankers and cargo vessels mid-ocean, refusing to sail their vulnerable fleets anywhere near the contested maritime borders. Allied defense ministries in Tokyo, Manila, and London called emergency overnight sessions, their military leaders staring at the same horrific damage assessments, realizing that the protective umbrella they had relied upon for decades had just been violently pierced. There was no victory cheer across the international airwaves, and there was no immediate kinetic counterattack launched in retaliation. Instead, an agonizing, heavily armed standoff settled over the dark waters of the Pacific. As heavily armored salvage vessels slowly began to tow the smoking, blackened hulls of the three shattered warships away under the cold storm clouds, the world was left to process a terrifying new reality. The established balance of global naval power had been violently overthrown in a matter of minutes, leaving commanders everywhere to realize that a much larger, far more devastating war was now entirely unavoidable.